The air over Kelron 7 tasted like rust and algae, a low-gravity marsh world. Its skies hung thick with storm clouds that never moved, suspended like a moldy lid over the soaked crust below. Even the sun, when it managed to burn through, appeared filtered, diluted to a dim smear across the horizon. The terrain gave no comfort. Ground squelched underfoot, spongy but slick, and the dense reeds emitted a scent like fermented meat every time they were disturbed. For the 14th Coalition Battalion, deployed along the Argesh line for 79 consecutive days, this world wasn't just hostile, it was wearing them down molecule by molecule. By the time the message from High Command arrived, morale had slumped to a point where even standardized tactical responses came in late or uncoordinated. Soldiers fought like machines that knew the routine but had lost the urgency. The Norex Clade, their enemy, understood that perfectly. Every night brought another sensory raid, disruption drones humming just outside detection range, audio feedback loops whispering under comms channels, motion alarms triggered with no contact. Each false alarm chipped away at sanity, and each real one cut deeper. Sarek Valen stood waist-deep in stagnant runoff near the western trench fork, eyes scanning the cloud breaks while his mandibles remained locked tight against the filtered rebreather. He was Chlorothi, genetically evolved for high-density atmospheres, precision-minded, and doctrinally devout. A second-generation combat officer, Sarek had graduated from the Spire Academy with honors in strategic integration and macro-force management. Doctrine mattered to him. Protocol had meaning. But what he'd seen on Kelron 7 in the last 3 weeks defied even his worst-case projections. Their formations degraded. Section leaders were beginning to ad-lib. Protocol reinforcement sims were being ignored. The trench lines had shifted 4 times, not because of combat, but because no one could agree where the line even was anymore. In his daily internal report, he'd marked the battalion's cohesion at 42%. Combat viable but structurally collapsing. It was the kind of phrase he hoped would be noticed by the command echelon before things spiraled further. Then the humans arrived. The kinetic drop capsules tore into the marshland without warning, 6 of them slamming down within meters of the primary trench perimeter. There were no clearance codes sent ahead, no orbital pings, no flagging of Coalition IFF tags, just 6 screaming cylinders punching into mud and sediment like missiles. Coalition squads scattered in panic, weapons drawn and targeting systems flaring red. Sarek rushed from the comm station expecting the worst, a misfire, a Norex decoy pod, a breach. Instead, the capsule doors hissed open and 6 armored figures emerged. They moved without formation but not without purpose. Each one carried packs that looked too large for their frames, dragging composite crates behind them, some hefting metallic rods with spherical end caps. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't respond to open hails. They didn't salute. They didn't even look at the coalition troops staring at them, rifles half raised. One of them, shorter than the others, helmet scarred and matte, walked straight into the west trench line, stepped over 2 stunned coalition engineers, and began reconfiguring the motion sensor grid by hand. Sarek ordered his translator node to broadcast authorization challenges. No response came, not static, nothing. He descended into the trench after them, mud sloshing over his boots as he approached what he assumed was their commanding figure, broad-chested, carrying 3 small pylons tucked under one arm. "You are operating in a registered kill box," Sarek said, keeping his voice even. "These corridors are coalition-locked and mapped for trip-point defense. State your clearance." The figure paused just long enough to glance over, helmet visor opaque and unreadable, then pointed to the trench wall. Behind a layer of wet moss, the human had just installed a secondary sensor relay. Redundant, Sarek thought, until he noticed its pattern was offset by a quarter cycle. That wasn't redundancy. It was layered override. They didn't explain. They didn't offer reasoning. They kept moving. Sarek tried for 2 hours to catalog their adjustments. Each cable they laid was rerouted through pre-existing communication fiber, spliced without schematic overlay. Their trench modifications ignored coalition angles, reworked line-of-sight cover, and eliminated fallback redundancy in favor of single-direction fire lanes. When one of the engineers moved a barricade and exposed a breach-prone wall segment, Sarek opened his mouth to correct him, only to watch the human bury a flat dispersal node against it and press it flush. The system blinked green. Sarek had never seen that equipment before. He had no idea what it did. By 1400 local, all 6 humans had dispersed through the battalion perimeter. Not once did they gather in formation. Not once did they consult with coalition command. They moved as if no one else was there, as if this was a cleanup job already half finished. A low-ranking Tavaran corporal tried to approach one with a field pad, asking for names and IFF syncs. The human walked past him without a word. The pad's interface glitched when it neared the human's torso. Non-standard mesh, someone said. Probably military black layer. It was the first and last time anyone tried to interface. By the time the sun began its descent, an orange smear across the horizon that barely warmed the mist curling over the trenches, the humans were still at work. Sarek watched from the upper platform near the east sensor tower, arms folded behind his back, as one of them laid a series of cabling lines out into the marsh. He moved in slow, deliberate arcs, pausing every few meters to stake thin rods into the ground, each one tipped with a reflective marker. The pattern didn't match any coalition schema. When Sarek overlaid the lines against the existing terrain map, it created no known net, no triangulation, no weapon grid. It was something else. He filed his doubts into a private annotation archive. He didn't include it in his tactical report. Below, the human finished his final arc, pressed a button on his wrist pad, and the cabling lit briefly. No sound, just a low flicker of blue. Then darkness returned. The human stood alone at the edge of the trench for a moment, head tilted slightly upward. Then he turned back into the fog, not a word spoken. Sarek didn't know what they were building. He only knew this: they were not like the others. And whatever came next, he suspected they already knew how it would end. The second nightfall after the humans arrived came colder, the marsh winds carrying a sharpness that bit deeper than before. Fog rolled in over the northern embankments, dense enough to blur sentry vision down to 30 meters. At 0200 hours local, a ripple spread through the sensor grid. Most of the battalion brushed it off as another Norex ghost pulse, another false flag meant to draw focus while the real incursion came elsewhere. But the humans moved fast. Sarek caught the motion from the upper parapet, eyes narrowing as 2 of the human soldiers peeled off from the trench without request or briefing. They weren't reacting to the ripple like it was unexpected, they were following it. Sergeant Vex appeared seconds later, his armored bulk distinct even in the dark, and made a direct line toward the eastern fusion pylon array. Sarek followed at a distance, boots sinking into the wet soil with every step. The eastern pylons weren't meant for offensive use. They generated overlapping electromagnetic shields in the event of a breach surge. Coalition doctrine forbade direct repurposing of such critical assets without high command authorization. Vex didn't ask. The sergeant knelt by the junction node and popped the access panel, ignoring the static buzz bleeding off the outer coils. He reached into his pack and pulled out a hardened data slug, unmarked. Without ceremony, he slotted it into the system. Sarek stepped closer, expecting a series of security beeps or override alerts. There were none. The fusion pylon flickered once, hummed, then recalibrated its core. The coil temperature display began spiking, not into redline but into some alternate calibration Sarek had never seen. It wasn't being overloaded, it was being tuned. Resonance, he realized. The pylons were being converted into pressure-frequency traps. Across the line, the other 5 humans moved just as deliberately. 2 worked in the south trench, laying down node cables along dirt seams. Another pair placed flat charges, thin, almost decorative in appearance, against the trench floor at precise intervals. The final soldier was already posting up by the munitions depot, adjusting the arc fields to face not outward but inward toward the marsh. Every action was deliberate, no movement was wasted, and not a single one of them communicated verbally or through open channel. Sarek didn't understand the purpose, but his instinct told him one thing with certainty. This wasn't reactionary. This was preemption. At exactly 0230, the trench sensors tripped. The displacement wave came not from the sides, but from beneath. 8 meters down, spreading fast, the earth began to vibrate in pulses too rhythmic to be natural. Tunnel bursters. The Norex had shifted tactics, deploying subsurface assault lines, likely intended to breach directly under coalition command tents. A common move, wait until enemy morale breaks, then hit them from below where panic spreads faster. But this time, the humans were already positioned. The first breach came with a wet crunch of soil rupturing like a lung, but before the Norex claws could surface, the fusion pylon emitted a focused resonance burst directly through the ground. The waves snapped the tunnel structure like brittle glass, imploding the shaft and compressing the air within. What followed was not an explosion in the traditional sense, but a thermal detonation of concentrated gas. It ignited within the compacted oxygen layer of the Norex tunnel system, venting heat and pressure upward in a column that lit the sky with a brief, unnatural blue glow. Half a dozen more ruptures followed, each one met with the same trap. Compressed tunnels collapsed in on themselves before the enemy could surface. Some Norex that breached too early were torn apart mid-emergence, their bodies flung upward in curling arcs by the blast force, limbs still twitching as they landed. The humans didn't cheer. They didn't even pause. As the final rupture burned out near the southeast flank, the team moved again. Sarek watched in stunned silence as Vex raised one hand, 2 fingers pointed skyward, then curled inward. A signal. Immediately, the fallback corridors, previously ignored, barely marked, lit up in sequence. Thin strips of pre-laid biomarkers hidden beneath the topsoil hours earlier activated. The marsh reacted violently. Flames erupted along the retreat lines, bright and narrow, cutting clean paths through the terrain. It was no accident. The fire didn't spread randomly. It followed pre-fed gel paths, burning straight down a funnel design that herded anything coming from the outer brush into a tight corridor no wider than a troop carrier. Sarek finally understood. The fallback routes weren't meant for coalition troops. They were meant to herd the enemy. That's when the Norex surface wave hit. Hundreds of them, emerging from adaptive shell pods, broke from the marsh edges and rushed the embankments, only to find themselves squeezed between walls of fire and forced into the funnel's narrow mouth. They couldn't disperse, couldn't flank, couldn't use numbers. 3 human soldiers were already waiting. They didn't use rifles. Instead, each carried a weapon Sarek had only seen referenced in classified memos, short-barreled electromagnetic lances built for close-quarters suppression. The weapons pulsed with visible arcs, lancing through enemy formations with controlled, almost surgical discharges. Every second shot hit center mass. The third, head level. The Norex tried to retreat, but the walls behind them still burned. Tried to scatter, but the corridor narrowed with every meter. Within minutes, the line was broken. Not by artillery, not by force, by design. A battle planned hours before it was fought. When the last Norex dropped, still smoldering, Vex lowered his lance, adjusted the coil dial, and walked back toward the trench without a word. His boots left blackened prints on the marsh floor. Sarek didn't follow, not immediately. He remained near the edge of the funnel, staring at the perfect pattern of bodies and burn arcs. They hadn't just won, they had pre-written the come. Later, as the med teams moved in and reports were filed with quiet disbelief, Sarek stood atop the trench wall, visor reflecting the distant fires still flickering across the eastern field. He no longer wondered what the humans were doing. He now understood what terrified him most. They didn't respond to attacks. They prepared for them before anyone else even believed the threat was real. They didn't just kill, they made decisions about where death would happen and simply ensured no one interrupted the execution. The following night fell with an eerie stillness that didn't belong. There were no distant alarms, no buzzing of swamp insects, no shifting of marsh water from perimeter drags. The air was heavy, not with humidity, but with pressure, a sensation that settled on the skull rather than the skin. Sarek stood at the eastern signal platform, staring at the horizon where the mist hadn't moved for hours. The stars overhead flickered wrong, not in brightness, but in rhythm, like something behind the sky was interfering. Then the communications array dropped out. At first it was subtle. The command lattice flickered. Long-range uplinks began returning corrupted packets. Command AIs issued repeat requests, then shifted to redundancy mode. Minutes later, the battalion's tactical overlays began rerouting as data loss climbed past 11%. Sarek's command HUD glitched in his peripheral vision, and one of his junior officers reported a split-loop event, the same message repeating with altered punctuation, over and over, each version more fragmented than the last. The Norex weren't attacking with claws or fire. They were speaking in code. Across the forward trench, the first human disconnected. One by one, their suit interfaces blinked dark. Coalition IFF tags faded. Their beacons stopped broadcasting. To the rest of the battalion, it looked like system failure. But Sarek knew better. These weren't glitches. They were exits. Sergeant Vex was the last to disengage, kneeling beside the now silent command node and physically cutting his uplink cable before reaching into his pack. What he pulled out looked primitive, an optical transceiver rig with hard mount brackets and a compact light coil. Sarek had seen archived footage of such devices. They belonged in history archives, not live combat. Vex snapped the housing shut, flipped a tiny lens upward, and the human unit began moving. No words, no transmissions, just flashes. Every 10 seconds, a quick pulse burst. Infrared, tight spectrum, invisible to coalition optics. But when Sarek squinted through his scope, he saw the suit panels respond. They blinked in reply. Some fast, some slow, some repeated in rhythmic cycles. It wasn't chaos, it was language, and he couldn't read a word of it. The Coalition Command AI crossed the 17% neural interference threshold and triggered its fail-safe, override. All ground units were now ordered to revert to auto-routing protocols and follow digital command heuristics until link stability returned, a doctrine designed to eliminate battlefield confusion. But what it did instead was erase decision-making. Troops began to reposition according to pre-fed algorithms, completely unaware that the terrain had already changed. Sarek tried to override the override. He couldn't. He turned, looking for the humans. They were gone. Not scattered, just not trackable. His HUD refused to display their tags. The marsh around him flickered in the fog light, and then something stepped into their space. It didn't walk. It didn't move the way bodies should. It arrived in broken frames, appearing 5-meter tests forward, then to the left, then again, but reversed. A shimmer of claws and multi-eyed sockets that blinked asynchronously. Its mass distorted gravity in pulses, compressing and stretching time in jagged beats. It didn't breathe. It resonated. The first distortion unit. Others followed. Coalition troops scattered. Some fired, most froze. One soldier dropped to his knees, hands clamped over his head, screaming before the thing even touched him. The distortion units didn't kill with weapons. They unwrote proximity. Standing near one meant your senses lost sequence. Smell came before sound. Vision collapsed in patterns. Sarek fell back behind a burnt barricade, vision shaking, and saw 2 distortion units folding through each other, arms melding and detaching as they crossed over with no impact. That was when the human suits lit up. A deep, rolling hum, not auditory but physical, pushed through the ground. Sarek felt it in his ribs, not his ears. The humans stepped back into view, their shoulder pads now flashing coded pulses. their feet synchronizing step patterns that pulsed the frequency deeper into the ground. The distortion units paused, not in confusion, something closer to hesitation. Their frames flickered faster. One attempted a step, and its leg reappeared upside down for a fraction of a second. Another tried to split into two paths. One version collided with itself and collapsed. Then came the collapse. One by one, the distortion units twisted inward, not like bodies folding, like ideas being refuted. Their limbs spasmed, stretching until they snapped into nothing. No blood, no scream, just a shriek in a register lower than perception, higher than logic. A subharmonic scream that made Sarek's eyes water and his memory blur at the edges. Sergeant Vex adjusted a dial on his gauntlet. That was all. No weapon fired, no warning issued, just a shift in frequency. Another distortion unit tried to resist. It convulsed, its shadow disconnected from its body, twitching on the ground in a different shape. A moment later, its torso liquefied inward. Gone. Evaporated like foam under pressure. Coalition troops watched from a distance, not daring to approach. By the time the last entity collapsed, the marsh was silent again. The static in the sky ceased. The communications array blinked, rebooted. Tactical overlays tried to recalibrate, but now half the map was blank. Units no longer reported. Some soldiers had fled entirely, throwing down gear and running west without orders. Sarek rose slowly, eyes on the humans as they regrouped near the eastern trench. No celebration, no acknowledgement. They checked their suits, resynced their optical rigs, and began walking the perimeter. One stopped by the remains of a distortion unit, if remains was the right word, and marked the ground with a red beacon. Not to warn others. To catalog success. That night, Sarek didn't write a report. He simply sat, hands clasped, and tried to remember when exactly he stopped feeling safer beside them. He'd feared the Norex distortion units, but that fear had form. What he now felt watching the humans had none. They had not resisted the distortion. They had taught the universe how to break it. Dawn didn't break on Kelron 7. It seeped. The fog thinned by degrees, light leaking across the marsh in gradients too slow to feel natural. Most mornings, Sarek stood for the roll reports and comm briefings like doctrine demanded. That morning, he was already on the move. The humans had crossed the line. No announcement, no coordination, just movement, quiet, deliberate, inevitable. They stepped over the boundary markers of the Eastern Exclusion Zone, an area still flagged as high contamination due to unresolved Norex signal spill. Coalition protocol marked it Black Tarai, a code phrase meaning do not engage without formal clearance. The humans didn't care. They crossed without pause, boots sloshing through mire that hissed against their suits. Vex was the first. The others followed in pairs, maintaining silent spacing like they knew what the terrain demanded. Sarek stood on the embankment watching them disappear into the reed wall, a cold pulse in his gut rising louder than any warning alarm ever had. He should have let them go. Instead, he called for 5 volunteers and followed. They made it through the marsh boundary in 20 minutes, but time felt fractured inside the zone. Every meter gained twisted the environment slightly off axis. The ground underfoot was no longer spongy. It pushed back. The air pressure wasn't consistent. One breath felt thin, the next thick with invisible weight. The humans advanced undeterred, their helmets sealed, movement steady. Sarek's Chlorothi lungs burned under the fluctuating tension, but he kept his eyes locked on Vex's back, following the faint shimmer of his suit's optical field. Then the marsh opened. It wasn't a base. There were no walls, no fortifications, just a space, a deliberate absence of terrain surrounded by geometric tree forms, each one pulsing with embedded logic thread. At the center stood the chamber, half organic, half machine, and fully wrong. It pulsed with colorless light, a shimmer that didn't reflect but swallowed. Its surface rippled as if metal remembered how to breathe. panels peeled open, revealing sinew and circuitry grown together. Neural cords stretched from the base like wet roots, feeding into rows of replication tanks. Inside each one floated a partial form, a distortion unit in mid-gestation, shape undetermined, motion looping in recursive spasms. Sarek froze, not because of what he saw, but because of who he saw in it. The neural imprints projected on the chamber's upper interface weren't random, they were familiar. Coalition command structures, tactical voice overlays, visual identifiers lifted from frontline officers, his species, his people. One set of projections shifted into Clorathi script, his own squad's dialect. Another loop displayed his former XO's neurofragment, restructured into feedback code. They weren't just cloning bodies, they were reusing minds. Each distortion unit wasn't born, it was reassembled, stitched together from battlefield recordings, dead soldier scream maps, and tactical reaction logs. Memory inverted. Sarek staggered back, bile rising in his throat. The humans didn't flinch. Vex opened his chest compartment and withdrew 2 canisters, smooth, black, labeled with no visible markings. He uncapped both and began pouring thick, reactive foam across the chamber's interface lines. The other humans split without instruction, layering foam along neural cords, tank roots, and outer shell junctions. It clung like tar but shimmered faintly, already reacting to something inside the structure. Sarek took a step forward. "What is that?" he asked. None of them answered. One of the humans turned slightly, helmet tilting just enough to acknowledge the question, then returned to work. Sarek understood. Not refusal. Irrelevance. Once the foam sealed every active node, Vex keyed his gauntlet. Protocol OBOL activated. It wasn't an explosion. It was a silencing. The foam triggered an internal cascade, not of destruction, but of signal erasure, not physical damage. Conceptual removal. The chamber stopped pulsing, the tanks lost color, the logic threads dimmed into dust. Every half-born distortion unit inside the tank spasmed once, then sagged like puppet strings cut. One twitched violently, attempting to re-engage loop protocols. Its neural feed began replaying combat telemetry. Try. Visuals from trench footage, sensor lines from Kelron 7's Western Front. Then it stalled. The loop broke. A feedback shriek built in pitch, then vanished mid-sound, cut off before it could climax. One by one, the others followed. The chamber walls flexed inward, not collapsing, imploding, as if the structure couldn't exist without its signal identity. Shapes bled into flatness, interfaces flickered with corrupted code, unreadable. Smoke began to rise, not from heat, but from logic collision. What they had built here wasn't just physical, it was parasitic cognition, a system designed to believe itself alive through others' memories. Now denied its input, it came apart. Vex walked to the chamber's outer edge, drew a strip of thermal chalk from his side holster, and marked a single line across the shell's surface. One long horizontal slash, no words, no symbol, just the line. Sarek asked what it meant. Vex turned to him, visor dimming just enough to reveal the shape of his eyes. "Reminder," he said. Then he walked away. Behind them, the chamber continued to decay. The last distortion form, half unformed, twitched in its tank until the fluid turned gray. Its limbs locked, its body unknit. No scream, just one long flicker of broken perception, then stillness. When they reached the marsh edge again, the fog felt thinner, the gravity normalized. Time returned to something close to linear. The coalition volunteers with Sarek remained silent, none daring to speak of what they'd seen. There was no debrief, no flag to raise, nothing to secure, only the memory of something that had no name, only intent. And one line, still burning into Sarek's mind. A single slash of chalk, left on a wall not to warn the enemy, to warn the humans themselves. The dropships came at first light, no fanfare, no formation, 6 black hulls cut down through Kelron 7's murky skies like ink strokes on rotted canvas. They didn't transmit landing codes or await clearance. They simply descended, engines silent until touchdown, retrojets kicking up sheets of mud and shredded reed across the trench line. The coalition scrambled to receive them, assuming some formal procedure would follow. A joint operations handoff, maybe a post-engagement briefing. But the humans didn't line up. They didn't submit logs. They didn't wait. They walked straight from the marsh, boots coated in residue, and boarded their respective ships. One by one, they vanished behind closing hatches. No one saluted. No one looked back. Within minutes, the ships lifted off, leaving only churned swamp behind. By the time the dust settled, the humans were already vanishing from the sky, vapor trails curling into the cloud cover. They hadn't issued a single sentence of debrief. No mission summary, no after-action report. They had entered the conflict for 20 standard hours, altered its outcome entirely, and left without explanation or claim. Coalition Command issued a statement 2 hours later. It praised the combined efforts of the 14th Battalion and Earth Tactical Attachment Delta 6 for executing a flawless joint suppression of hostile Norex assets. It cited tactical coordination, adaptation under duress, and exemplary field efficiency. The report included 2 maps and 3 heat signatures, all sanitized, all meaningless. Sarek received a form prompt to upload commendation entries. He closed the message without opening it. He tried to write it once. He really did. He sat in the corner of his quarters, field pad in hand, staring at the blinking cursor. He typed the word effective, then deleted it. He tried efficient, deleted that too. He scrolled through the defam, bolt phrases, conducted with honor, mission alignment successful, minimal collateral. Each one felt thinner than the air over the black zone. Nothing he wrote could frame what he'd seen without turning it into something safe, something it wasn't. So he submitted nothing. Instead, he locked his door and replayed his helmet footage. The screen blinked into life, a timestamp, marsh fog. Then Vex, shoulders squared, gait steady, moving through the distortion chamber. The view swayed slightly with Sarek's breath. In the feed, Vex stepped over something twitching, never looking down, never hesitating. His arm moved, not fast, not slow, but with a precision that looked rehearsed, chalk in hand, one line across scorched surface, nothing else. The footage didn't stutter. There was no dramatic music, no sensor warnings, no screams, just movement, deliberate, ordered, final. Death was present in every frame, but not felt. Sarek watched himself move behind the humans, watched his own hand tremble, the way his helmet lens jittered with every neural spike. Then he'd glance to the side and catch Vex in the background, steady as bedrock, unaffected by proximity to the very things that broke Sarek's pulse rate in half. Later in the feed, one of the distortion units collapsed mid-fold. Its form shattered without impact, like reality itself rejected its presence. Vex never flinched, not when it screamed in frequencies below vocal range, not when its shadow convulsed independently of its body. The camera caught the moment its collapse triggered a brief ripple, like the world itself paused. Vex blinked once, adjusted his gauntlet, and kept walking. Sarek paused the footage there, rewound, played it again. No reaction, no words, no acknowledgement. In the days that followed, Sarek tried to return to protocol. He showed up for morning briefings, he delivered sensor updates, he coordinated repair crews, but he stopped responding when asked for future recommendations. He no longer offered opinions during tactical simulations, he simply watched. And when the simulations ran unknown enemy behavior loops, he found himself staring too long at the screen, heart rate rising without cause. The dreams began on the 4th night. They started with noise, dull static followed by silence, then a single blue light flickering in mist, then footsteps, not fast, measured, always behind him, never catching up. One night he dreamed of walking the trench alone, only to find every soldier standing at attention, but their faces flickered like broken projections, all of them marked with one white slash of chalk across their helmets. When he woke, he couldn't breathe until he vomited. He stopped sleeping after that. Other soldiers noticed but said nothing. His posture changed. His speech slowed. One officer remarked in passing that Sarek was operating like he was out of sync with the grid. He didn't argue. It was accurate. He'd been shown something that rewrote the baseline. Not by grandeur, not by firepower, but by certainty, by silence. The humans had come into their space, rewritten the rules, and left without explanation, as if they had only paused here in passing, as if the war was simply a scheduling inconvenience. He attended one final briefing, standard strategic forecast, minor Norex incursion modeling, and left halfway through. He didn't return to his post. He filed for reassignment instead, not with reason, just coordinates. Any theater not marked for Earth collaboration. When asked why, he gave no justification. There was none he could explain without sounding irrational, without sounding broken. But the truth was simpler that language allowed. He wasn't afraid of the Norex anymore. He was afraid of the calm. The way Vex walked past screaming enemies as if they weren't there. The way the humans never looked proud, never looked stressed. The way they never needed to say what they were doing, because it had already been done. He feared their silence more than the enemy's rage, and every time he closed his eyes, he didn't hear orders or alarms or last words. He heard one word. Reminder. 3 years passed, long enough for most combat veterans to rotate off-world, long enough for doctrines to shift, and longer still for Kelron 7 to fade from routine intelligence briefings. The official record showed a minor engagement there, 24 Norex tunnel incursions, a successful suppression action, and the reclamation of eastern trench positions. Not a single mention of Protocol Obol, not a line of text about distortion units. The humans were referenced only once, in an appendix. Earth Tactical Attachment Delta 6, no detail, no outcomes, just the name. Sarek read the entry twice before closing the archive permanently. He had transferred twice since then, first to a logistics command post on Virak Moon, then to the defensive mapping division at the Inner Spiral Relay. Neither role placed him within range of human deployments. He made sure of that. The dreams hadn't stopped. If anything, they had evolved. What started as flickers, blue light in fog, footsteps in static, had grown into full recreations. The distortion chamber returned often, sometimes intact, sometimes warped. He would walk its corridors alone, only to find them marked again. Not with messages, not with names. Just the same thing, always. A single chalk line across a wall scorched black. He woke from those with his breathing steady but his spine cold, as if his body knew something his mind still wouldn't say aloud. Then the new alert came through. Border world Ilex 3. Norex signals confirmed. Civilian habitats already gone silent. Interference rising across all outer-tier monitoring stations. It mirrored Kelron 7's early patterns, signal bleed, null loop detection, and what Intel tagged non-conforming movement profiles. Coalition analysts began triaging resources. Sarek, now posted as operations advisor for interspecies threat escalation, was asked to provide recommendations. He offered one. Deploy Earth. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't even on the response chart. But he submitted the petition anyway, direct, succinct, and flagged as priority. He didn't attach justification. He didn't need to. They knew what he'd seen. The file was rejected within hours. Earth had withdrawn. Not diplomatically, not politically, operationally, quietly. No announcements, no debate. One by one, their joint command offers had expired without renewal. Their tactical advisors vanished from coordination channels. They declined invitations to war councils. They stopped responding to strategic drafts. When pressed, Earth's formal liaison transmitted a single message: no further deployment authorization, nothing more. The Spiral Consortium classified the Norex resurgence on Ilex 3 as a Tier 2 threat. Not critical, manageable. Sarek disagreed, but said nothing. He knew what would happen. The battle would unfold predictably. The Norex would adapt faster than projected. The defense would fracture. Eventually, it would stabilize, at the cost of hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. And no one would ever understand that it didn't have to. He sat alone in the outpost observation chamber that night, watching the pulse charts drift across his screen, and let the silence settle. Not just silence of noise, but the absence of a presence he'd only known once. A tactical quiet so absolute that even fear couldn't reach it. He could still remember it, not as data, not as sound, but as shape. The shape of a plan executed without friction. The shape of movement designed before the battlefield existed. The shape of chalk across a wall, placed not for communication, but for closure. He'd spent years thinking the fear came from what the humans did. But now he understood. The terror was in the restraint, in the ceiling. They never declared superiority, never corrected anyone. They didn't claim leadership. They didn't demand deference. They simply arrived, solved, and left, without ever revealing what they were truly capable of. Kelron 7 had shown only a glimpse, a single procedure, a fixed window, 20 hours, not even a full cycle, not even effort, just presence. And that presence had broken a logic chamber grown from stolen minds, had ended distortion units engineered to erase thought, had rewritten the battlefield without even raising their voices. It wasn't victory, it was redirection. They hadn't fought the war, they had stepped around it. Sarek leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, and the image came again. The corridor, the scent of burnt marsh matter, the still hissing walls of the chamber as it collapsed in silence. Vex walking past the twitching remains of something that had once learned how to move through folded space. And on that wall, still warm, still glowing under the residual heat, a single white slash. Nothing else, no signature, no warning, no flourish, just a reminder. He opened his eyes slowly, whispering the thought that had followed him ever since. It wasn't what they did. It was knowing they didn't even try their worst. What would you do if you saw a species that wins wars without speaking, who erases threats not with weapons, but with silence and design? Was humanity right to walk away from the table, or is their absence the scariest move of all? Let us know in the comments. Would you trust them or fear them? And if this story left a mark, hit that subscribe button.